Hello and welcome to the program today. I'm Layo Larinde. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba is in Africa. He began his African tour in Senegal. It's the first tour to African countries in the history of Ukrainian diplomacy. The Ukrainian diplomat met with Senegal's Foreign Minister Aissata Tall Sall, and they signed several bilateral cooperation deals. Well, the tour is from the 3rd of October till the 12th. And will also be part of preparations for holding a large-scale Ukraine-Africa conference. Mr. Kuleba is seen as being on an apparent counter-offensive tour following a visit to the continent by Russia's top diplomat Sergei Lavrov back in July, ahead of plans to host the second Russia-Africa summit in Ethiopia next year. In Burkina Faso, the new junta leader says that the West African nation will still aim to hold an election by 2024 or even earlier. The power grab by Captain Ibrahim Traoré is the latest setback for the regional bloc ECOWAS, which has tried to steer 3 of its 15 countries back towards democracy. And that's coming after a spate of coups in the region over the last 2 years. Meanwhile, the ousted military leader of Burkina Faso has left the country and is now confirmed to be in Togo. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Henry Demiba, who had been in power for 8 months, formally resigned on Sunday, 2 days after being toppled by a rival faction. Well, a delegation from ECOWAS is expected in Ouagadougou to try to help restore calm following the country's second coup this year. Well, let's bring in a public affairs analyst for more discussions. We have joining us Oluseyi Adeyemo. Thank you for your time on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Well, there had been some decisions made by the Burkina Faso's new junta leader. That was during his meeting with cabinet ministers on Monday, and now he's saying that the country aims to hold elections in 2024, which is the time that ECOWAS had given, or even earlier. Do you see this really happening?
I mean, he said that he's going to have an election. The question is that what we need the most at this time? Because a lot of commentators around the world have said, I mean, are we really sure that we should be rushing into an election? Because at the end of the day, one will really look at it, there's a lot of problem on ground that needs to be dealt with. So rushing into an election might not be the most important thing to be done right now, but he has promised to have an election. Maybe we'll have election. At this point, nobody can say for a fact.
Well, perhaps this should be, one of the topics of discourse when the ECOWAS delegation arrive in Ouagadougou. They're expected in the country to help bring about calm in the nation. What else do you think should be on ground for ECOWAS to really discuss? I mean, this is another country that has now seen 2 coups in 1 year.
When Kambore was forced out of office in Mali in 2014, we all rejoiced and said, oh, this is another version of the Arab Spring, in the belief that we now have a situation where you have a new government, a new start and all. But clearly, they have failed in the way they have managed the affairs of that country. In Mali, you have had several coups and counter coups. Now, the same thing is being repeated in Burkina Faso. In fact, right when said that the Burkina Faso is the epic of all sorts of insurgency, all sorts of instability in the whole of West Africa. So the question is ECOWAS going to continue to wait until they have the military coming, or they will help us choose right managers who will not continue to bleed us dry, who will not continue to leave us to insurgency? Because when you talk about insurgency, all over the world, we know that you have ISIL, you have Al-Qaeda, you have Boko Haram. They're all out there, and they're looking for vulnerable countries that are not properly guarded, countries that are not properly protected. He is unmuted.
Military coups, were a regular occurrence in Africa in the decades after independence, but there's now some concern that they're starting to become more frequent. What do you think? Are military takeovers on the rise again on the continent?
Without a doubt, they're on the rise. I mean, it's unfortunate because usually when you have military coups, they throw a very rusty spine into the works of the lives of everyone. And so nobody wants military coups. Everybody wants a situation where we have democratically elected government. But the truth of the matter is, I repeat, we have had terrible managers in Africa, particularly in West Africa. And the way they have managed our resources, you are not likely to be able to wave everybody away. Yes, you have some of us who are reasonable, who would prefer that some of these things are discussed on the table, who would prefer that we solve our problems in a civilized manner, but you're not going to have everybody think that way. So if we do not do the right thing and we expect that everybody will keep quiet forever, then we are not being truthful to ourselves. So my advice to Africa, to ECOWAS, to AU, is that we do everything within our power to ensure that the true managers who are able to truly manage the resources of Africa, specifically West Africa in this case, are the ones that are allowed to take over government. We should not wait until there's a problem before we step in. So ECOWAS should be the one leading, because they're supposed to be leading the wealth, the economy, the prosperity of the people. But if you don't have the economy properly managed, people will continue to be impoverished. People can't go to farm, they are afraid, so they are hungry, and the support we're expecting from the superpowers are not going to come. I mean, I'm sure you know that right now, the EUs and the rest of them are taking their support to Ukraine, because at the end of the day, it is profitable for them to take the support there. So as long as we keep being a people that keep expecting, right now we're not even getting the support as we used to get, because there's Ukraine and Russia. So that's the problem.
Public affairs analyst Oluseyi Adeyemo, thank you so much for your thoughts on the program.
For having me.
Kenya will be demanding the delivery of finance and technology that it says the continent needs to adapt to climate change at the global summit, climate summit in Egypt next month. Now, this is according to President William Ruto, who is calling for African countries to give priority to climate change, which has devastated the continent, by leading in development of clean energy. He says despite being the most affected by climate change, Africa has the opportunity to lead the world and show that we do not need to destroy the climate to prosper. Well, as developing countries call out their more developed brethren ahead of the next climate summit in Egypt in November, the United Nations Secretary General has also joined their cause. The high-level speakers at the climate talks in Kinshasa particularly called out rich nations for failing to honor a $100 billion per year funding pledge to developing countries, warning that fair finance was needed to avert the worst of the climate crisis.
COP27 is critical, but we have a long way to go. Let's be clear, the collective commitments of G20 governments are coming far too little and far too late. The actions of the wealthiest developed and the emerging economies simply don't add up. Taken together, current pledges and policies are shutting the door on our chance to limit global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, let alone meet the 1.5 degree goal. We are in a life or death struggle for our own safety today and our survival tomorrow. And there is no time for pointing fingers or twiddling thumbs. It is time for a game-changing, quantum-level compromise between developed and emerging economies. The world cannot wait. On the central question of loss and damage, we know people and nations are suffering now. They need meaningful decisions now. Failure to act on loss and damage will lead to more loss of trust and more climate damage. This is a moral imperative that cannot be ignored, and COP27 must be the place for action on loss and damage. And at the same time, international financial institutions must overhaul their business model and approach to risk. Beyond pursuing their own drop-on-the-bucket initiatives, they must intensify their efforts to leverage the necessary massive increases of private finance as first investors and risk takers. On every climate front, the only solution is decisive action in solidarity. COP27 is the place for all countries, led by the G20, to show they are in this fight and in it together.
Amazon.com Incorporated founder Jeff Bezos' environmental fund is seeking to build a coalition of African and European countries around this year's UN Climate Summit to add heft to land restoration efforts. This is coming ahead of COP27 taking place this November in Egypt. The Bezos Earth Fund is pushing plans to reverse deforestation and land degradation on 100 million hectares in Africa by 2030.
One of the world's richest men, Jeff Bezos, is seeking to reverse deforestation and land degradation on around 250 million acres of land in Africa by the year 2030. That's according to Andrew Steer, chief executive of the Amazon founders Bezos Earth Fund.
Africa is a place where 60% of the soils have been degraded. And so by restoration, what we mean is a very simple idea. It is taking carbon up there in the atmosphere where it's causing a lot of trouble, is bringing it down to earth through the magic of photosynthesis into trees and bushes and crops and soils, where it brings, better incomes for farmers, better food security, more resilient soils, richer soils, healthier people, etc. I'm making it sound really great, and that's because it is great. And the good thing is there's now something called Africa 100, 100 million hectares of land in Africa to be brought back.
The initiative is led by African Union countries. The Bezos Earth Fund has pledged 30% of its $10 billion fund towards nature conservation, restoration, and food systems transformation. The actual grants issued so far, a spokesperson said, total a little over $1.5 billion. Africa has contributed very little in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, but the continent's countries are among the most vulnerable to its effects, as evidenced by recent floods and storms, as well as the Horn of Africa's worst drought in 4 decades.
Even before the war in Ukraine and even before COVID, things were very unfair for Africa. I mean, African farmers are suffering, appallingly from climate change. And at a time like this, when rich countries have now spent, $16 trillion on ourselves during the COVID period, building back better, sadly, funding for developing countries has fallen. So what we've been trying to do, and then this year, obviously, with rising fuel prices, rising food prices, I think the World Bank now estimates 100 million people will fall back into poverty, not only in Africa, but worldwide.
Developing countries have been increasingly demanding that wealthier, carbon-emitting nations pay reparations for climate-induced disasters.
Rich countries are going to have to play a bigger role on creating resilience, on helping poor countries and poor citizens to adapt. I mean, what we've done for the last 25 years is we've tended to say, and by the way, the environmental community has often been part of this, tended to say it's really important to stop climate change. That's more important. If we start adapting to climate change, we may give up on solving the problem.
Mr. Steer said that the Bezos Earth Fund is seeking to build a coalition of African and European countries around this year's UN Climate Summit taking place in Egypt in November to add heft to land restoration efforts.
Uganda's foreign ministry has distanced itself from a series of tweets posted by President Yoweri Museveni's son, joking about invading neighboring Kenya. The ministry said in a statement on Tuesday that it treasures the existing strong bilateral relations with brotherly neighbor Kenya and do not conduct official business over social media, hoping to smooth things over. In addition to the annexation talks, Lieutenant General Muhoozi Kainerugaba also tweeted about his disappointment that Kenya's former president, Uhuru Kenyatta, did not run for an unconstitutional third term in the recent elections, saying he would have won. Another tweet said, "Union is a must." He said in one post that was liked by 1,000 people on Twitter. In another, he said his army could capture the Kenyan capital in 2 weeks and that he had a great discussion with his father, who would announce changes. Well, some say Lieutenant General Kainerugaba is being groomed to succeed his 78-year-old father in Uganda. It's not the first time his tweets have raised eyebrows, but this latest talk of annexation prompted the foreign ministry's response. To health matters, South Sudan's health officials are testing samples from 5 people to see if they have contracted the Ebola virus. Local media reports that the suspected cases were detected in 3 regional states bordering neighboring Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Uganda is currently dealing with an outbreak of the hemorrhagic fever. 43 cases have been confirmed so far and 9 deaths recorded. But in South Sudan, no case has been confirmed. Well, in Uganda, health officials at a major Uganda-Kenya border crossing say they have intensified screening of cargo truckers and other travelers to prevent the export of the Ebola. An official at the Malabar border in the east says the teams have already been screening for several infectious diseases since the peak of the coronavirus pandemic, but have now increased their level of alertness. Health teams are taking details of travelers' point of origin in Uganda and checking for symptoms of Ebola. Well, at least 9 people are known to have died, including senior regional officials, after a car bomb attack that has been claimed by the Islamist group Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Police authorities say the explosions in the city of Bedlewine also injured several people and destroyed houses. Reports say the attack is possibly in retaliation for the killing of a senior Al-Shabaab member over the weekend. The Somali government said Abdullahi Nadir, who had a $3 million bounty on his head, was killed in a drone strike. Last month, it said Turkish drones had been deployed in the fight against the jihadists. Well, Al-Shabaab has recently lost territory and many fighters during clashes. Back here in Nigeria, in Lokoja, the Kogi state capital, Governor Yahaya Bello has assured residents that his administration will find a permanent solution to the issues of perennial flooding in the state. Governor Bello made the promise after visiting some of the flooded areas to assess the level of damages caused by the 2022 flood disaster.
Floodwaters in Kogi State are still rising, with most houses and roads in the state still surrounded by water. There have been severe cases of flooding over the years, but this year's incident is being described as waters reaching places previously not affected. After receiving reports of the disaster, the Kogi State Governor, Yahaya Bello, out to see the extent of the disaster in Lokoja, the state capital, as well as the extent of damage. He was received by the Commissioner for Environment, the Speaker of the Kogi State House of Assembly, and the local government chairman who took him round the affected areas.
Kogi is so strategically located that it has the confluence of both River Niger and Benue. And so this is the effect, Your Excellency. Immediately water is being released from Cameroon, hitting Shiruru.
All roads leading to Natako and the Lokoja-Abuja road have been cut off. The only way to and fro is by canoe, which takes the governor on his assessment. Governor Bello gives assurances to those affected that relief materials is on the way. as he also calls on President Muhammadu Buhari, corporate organizations and individuals, especially Kogi State indigents, to render assistance to the flood victims.
I call on President Muhammadu Buhari, I call on World Bank, I call on all other donor agencies and other well-spirited individuals and corporate bodies to come to our aid. This particular problem is not a problem that only Kogi State can solve. The people alone cannot solve it. So please, I am calling on everybody to please come on board and join hands with us to ensure that we save the situation. If Kogi State is cut off, more than 90% of both North and South have been cut off.
Governor Bello and his team also paid a visit to displaced persons with temporary accommodation at St. Luke's Primary School in Lokoja. After sympathizing with the victims, he assures them that the government will distribute consumables and non-consumable items to cushion the effect of the disaster.
We are not going to leave you alone. You are not alone in this disaster. I am here with you. We will, within our reach, within our power, we will bring all the necessary succor, palliative assistance to all of you in terms of food items, and when water recedes, we will ensure that those that need to be relocated from where they are to a new site on a more permanent basis, we are going to do that.
The state government also advises those whose houses are close to the water to move away.
Finally, on the program, Liberian authorities have seized some 100 million worth of cocaine at a suburb in the capital, Monrovia. The operation is said to have involved officers from the U.S. International Narcotics Agency. Now, this resulted in 3 arrests of a Liberian man, a Guinea-Bissau man, and a Lebanese national who was detained at the Sierra Leone border. The head of Liberia's Drug Enforcement Agency says several accomplices are now on the run. The U.S. Embassy hails the success of the operation, saying it was a direct result of excellent communication between law enforcement agencies around the world, including in Brazil, the United States, and Liberia. That's it on the program today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Layo Olarinde.